All right, everybody, welcome back for another deep dive with us.
Yeah.
Today, we are going to be tackling something a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
Usually we like to focus on these these big battles
Right.
that kind of change the course of a war.
Yeah. Yeah.
But today we're going to be talking about
Yeah.
something that's a little bit smaller scale.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, I think you'll find it pretty fascinating.
Right.
And this is a series of skirmishes that took place during the American Revolutionary War.
Uh-huh.
And they're collectively known as the Battle of the Cedars.
Right.
And this might seem like kind of a minor event in the grand scheme of things.
Mm-hmm.
But it actually, I think, opens up a really fascinating window into just how complex this conflict really was.
Absolutely. And I think so often we get kind of this textbook image of the American Revolution.
Yeah.
Redcoats versus, the brave Continentals.
Yeah.
And it was much more complicated than that.
Yeah.
And this battle really exemplifies that.
So to kind of set the scene here, this is May of 1776.
Okay.
And the Continental Army has launched this very ambitious invasion of Quebec.
Right.
And ultimately, it's going to be an unsuccessful invasion.
Mm-hmm.
But at this point, in May of 1776,
Right.
They've actually had some pretty impressive successes.
Yeah, they've taken Montreal.
Yeah.
They're trying to so up support.
Yeah.
Among the French Canadians, to join their cause.
Yeah.
And so far it's going fairly well.
Yeah, and so in this context, this location called the Cedars becomes very strategically important.
Right.
So the Cedars is about 45 kilometers west of Montreal.
Okay.
And it's where the St. Lawrence and Ottawa rivers come together.
Right.
So you can imagine controlling that location.
Mm-hmm.
Would give you a lot of control over the movement of troops.
Yeah, logistics, communications, all that stuff. That flows through those major waterways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's interesting is that because of the rapids on the St. Lawrence River,
right.
A lot of traffic had to portage around those rapids, which made the Cedars even more of a bottleneck.
Right.
And a place where you could kind of control who and what was moving through.
Yeah, and our sources for this battle are primarily historical summaries and accounts from the period.
Okay.
And they really emphasize the strategic importance of this location.
Yeah. So our mission today is to kind of really dig deep into these skirmishes at the Cedars. We want to understand what happened, who was involved, and as I mentioned earlier, it wasn't just the British and the Americans.
Right.
There were other groups involved as well.
Yeah.
And then we also want to look at what were the kind of the surprising repercussions of this battle. So to kind of get things started, can you tell us a little bit about the timeline and maybe fill in some of the details about this location?
Sure. So the action at the Cedars really unfolds quite rapidly.
Okay.
It takes place between May 18th and May 27th of 1776. And the exact location is Cèdres, Quebec.
Right.
And you're absolutely right. It's at this confluence of these major rivers, and controlling this area meant controlling access to a large region.
Yeah, and to kind of set the stage even further, the Americans actually got to the Cedars first.
Yeah.
And Benedict Arnold, who was always thinking ahead, he had sent a detachment there in April of 1776.
Right.
And he was hearing these rumors
of
British and Iroquois forces kind of gathering to the west. And so he wanted to establish a presence at the Cedars.
Right.
And he put Colonel Timothy Bedel and Lieutenant Isaac Butterfield in charge of that.
Okay.
And they even started to construct this wooden stockade fort.
Right. So that's a really important point. Arnold being proactive here. However, the British weren't idle.
Right.
Claude Nicolas Guillaume de Lorimier, who was a British Indian Department agent, he was very active in recruiting Iroquois warriors.
Okay.
After discussions with Captain George Forster at Fort de la Présentation, which was also known as Oswegatchie.
Okay.
So, this really highlights the fact that indigenous forces played a crucial role in this conflict.
Yeah, absolutely.
And were very active participants.
So it sounds like Forster is kind of the key British figure here. So what kind of a force did he manage to assemble?
Well, Forster's initial force was fairly modest.
Okay.
He had about 40 British regulars.
Okay.
and then a very small number of Canadian militiamen, only about 10.
Okay.
But then a more substantial number of Iroquois warriors.
Okay.
So initially he had 160.
Right.
And that number would later grow to 204.
Okay, so a mix of British regulars, Canadian militia,
Yeah.
and Iroquois warriors. Okay, and how about the Americans? What kind of numbers did they have at the Cedars?
So the Americans had approximately 400 regulars and militia at the Cedars.
Okay.
However, it's important to note that they weren't all concentrated in one place.
Okay.
When the initial confrontation happened.
Okay, 400 sounds like quite a sizable force.
Yeah, yeah.
So how did the situation go so badly for the Americans?
Yeah, that's a great question. It is.
What happened there?
So the initial surrender at the Cedars, which happened on May 19th,
Okay.
is kind of this pivotal moment.
Okay.
So Forster demands Butterfield's surrender.
Okay.
And Butterfield is trying to negotiate,
Right.
the best terms possible.
Yeah.
He asks to be allowed to withdraw his troops with their weapons.
Okay.
But Forster refuses that.
Okay.
And so this leads to this very brief exchange of fire.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that the historical record actually indicates that there were no American fatalities at the Cedars itself during this initial engagement.
So no casualties.
No casualties.
So was it just a brief standoff then, or?
Yeah, it's really hard to say exactly what happened.
Yeah.
But it does suggest something, about either the Americans' readiness
Yeah.
or maybe Butterfield's judgment
Yeah.
in that moment.
Okay, but this wasn't the end of the American involvement at the Cedars.
No, it wasn't.
Right, they sent reinforcements.
They did.
Yeah.
So Major Henry Sherburne
Okay.
was sent with 140 men to reinforce the American position at the Cedars.
Okay.
However, he receives this false report that the Cedars has already fallen.
Okay.
And so he initially retreats.
Okay.
He later advances again
Okay.
with about 100 men
Right.
towards Kinschens.
And Kinschens is about 16 kilometers from the Cedars.
Yeah, it's about right.
Okay, so is that where the reinforcements ran into trouble?
That's exactly where they ran into trouble.
Yeah.
So Lorimer, who's leading this force of Iroquois warriors,
Intercepts Sherburne's men as they're advancing.
Okay.
And they engage in this skirmish that lasts for about 40 minutes.
Okay.
And in the end, Sherburne surrenders.
Okay.
And he believed that he was significantly outnumbered.
Okay.
Casualties on the British and Allied side were very light.
Okay.
Just 1 killed and 4 or 5 wounded.
Okay.
However, the captured Americans
Yeah.
faced a much more difficult experience.
Right.
The Iroquois warriors stripped them of all their belongings.
Stripped them bare.
Stripped them bare, yeah.
Wow.
And,
That's a rough experience.
yeah, this was not an uncommon practice
Yeah.
among, indigenous warriors at the time.
Right.
It was seen as, a way to, humiliate their enemies.
Yeah.
But also to gain, some material benefit from their victory.
Right. So the Americans have lost the initial force at the Cedars.
Right.
And then they've also lost these reinforcements that were sent.
How did Arnold respond to all of this?
Well, Arnold, upon hearing about these defeats,
Yeah.
reacted with his usual energy and determination.
Yeah.
He quickly assembles a force of about 450 men, and starts marching towards the area.
Okay, so that's quite a counter move.
Yeah. It's
what's Forster doing in the meantime
yeah.
with all these American prisoners?
Well, so Forster first moves the prisoners to Kinschens.
Okay.
And then from there, he advances towards Fort Senneville.
And where's Fort Senneville?
Fort Senneville is located on the southwestern tip of Montreal Island.
Okay. Arnold's moving in one direction.
Mm-hmm.
Forster with the prisoners is moving in a different direction.
Right.
Did they ever actually come into conflict with each other?
They did.
Okay.
Arnold reaches Fort Senneville,
Okay.
which he promptly burns.
Right.
And then he attempts to cross the Ottawa River to engage Forster's forces.
Okay.
However, Forster has this crucial advantage. He had captured the 2 4-pound cannons that the Americans had initially brought to the Cedars.
Oh, wow.
And he effectively used these captured guns
Wow.
to drive Arnold and his men back across the river.
Okay, their own artillery used against them?
Yeah.
That's gotta sting.
Yeah, I'm sure it did.
Yeah, so how did this all end?
Well, so they're in this standoff across the river.
Right.
And ultimately negotiations
Yeah.
become the key to kind of de-escalating the
Oh,
situation.
okay.
And these negotiations were facilitated by Sherburne
Okay.
and Forster's deputy, a Lieutenant Park.
Okay.
And they eventually reach an agreement.
Wow.
And the American prisoners are returned to Arnold on May 30th.
So a prisoner exchange.
The prisoner exchange.
Yeah, it sounds like kind of a standard way of resolving things
Right.
during a war, but I get the sense that there's a little bit more to the story here.
You are absolutely correct.
Yeah.
There is.
What happened?
So the Second Continental Congress actually vehemently rejected this prisoner exchange. Really?
They did.
Oh.
They accused Forster of mistreating the American prisoners
Okay.
by turning them over to the Iroquois.
Oh, okay.
And this decision was really influenced by what we know from our sources
Yeah.
were inflated and often completely false reports of atrocities committed by the Iroquois.
So exaggerated reports and wartime narratives
Yes.
shaping political decisions.
It's a tale as old as time.
Yeah, it sounds very familiar.
Yeah.
So despite this agreement that had been reached
Right.
by the commanders on the ground,
Mm-hmm.
the American leadership essentially nullified the prisoner exchange.
Yeah, that's exactly what happened.
Wow. Okay. And what were the repercussions of that?
Well, this repudiation of the agreement by the Congress
Yeah.
had significant repercussions.
Okay.
It complicated future prisoner exchange efforts during the war,
Okay.
and it also created a diplomatic misstep.
Oh, okay. How so?
The letter of repudiation was addressed to Lieutenant General John Burgoyne.
Rather than the overall British commander, Guy Carleton.
So that was a deliberate slight then. It
It's
seemed
reason-
that way.
Yeah.
Okay. So what about the American officers who had been in command during
Yeah.
these losses at the Cedars?
Yeah.
What happened to them?
Well, so Colonel Timothy Bedel and Lieutenant Isaac Butterfield were both court-martialed
Okay.
for their conduct that had led to the surrenders.
Okay.
They were both found guilty and they were dismissed from the Continental Army,
Okay.
or cashiered, as it was known at the time.
And so what does that mean, cashiered?
So cashiered basically meant that they were, formally dismissed from military service.
Okay.
Their commissions were revoked.
Okay.
And they were, essentially disgraced.
Okay. So, but there's a twist to this story, right?
There is.
Oh.
So Bedel actually later volunteers his services again.
Okay.
And after Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga,
Yeah.
he is actually given a new commission by Congress in 1777.
Wow. So a second chance.
It's a second chance.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
So these events at the Cedars, despite their relatively small scale, had a pretty lasting impact.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
And in fact, the site of some of the skirmishes
Okay.
was actually designated a National Historic Site of Canada in 1928.
Wow.
In recognition of its significance within this broader narrative of the conflict in North America.
So it's amazing how these seemingly smaller events can still carry such historical weight.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there were some uncertainties and conflicting information
Right.
surrounding this whole Battle of the Cedars. What are some of those?
Well, so one of the most significant areas of uncertainty
Okay.
concerns the accounts of casualties and atrocities.
Okay.
So many older historical narratives,
Yeah.
contain these really vivid descriptions of violence that was attributed to the Iroquois. However, from what we can tell, from the sources that we have,
Yeah.
there's actually very limited concrete evidence to substantiate those claims.
Okay.
So there's a lot of debate about what actually happened.
Yeah.
And the extent to which the Iroquois were involved in any kind of atrocities.
Right.
The precise number and specific nations of Iroquois
Okay.
that were involved is also not definitively established.
Okay.
Though it's most likely that they were primarily those who were recruited by Lorimer.
Right.
And it's also important to point out one particular historical inaccuracy.
Okay.
And that is that some early accounts
Yeah.
mistakenly linked Joseph Brant,
Okay.
who was a prominent Mohawk leader.
Okay. To this event. However, historical research has since confirmed that he was actually in England at the time.
Yeah, he wasn't even there.
Yeah. So these unreliable accounts
Right.
potentially not only damaged reputations,
Right.
but maybe also shaped the American perspective
Right.
on dealing with indigenous allies of the British.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Throughout the war.
Yeah, so it maybe contributed to a more hardline stance or created some lasting mistrust.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Because it's fascinating how the narrative around this Battle of the Cedars has been, at least in part,
Right.
constructed on these potentially unreliable or even fabricated accounts.
Right, and I think this is just such a crucial reminder that, we always have to critically evaluate our sources, and be aware of, the potential for bias and propaganda, especially in times of conflict.
Especially during a war.
Yeah.
People are going to, shape the narratives.
Yeah, they're going to spin things.
Yeah, to their advantage.
Yeah, to make themselves look good.
Yeah.
And their enemies look bad.
Yeah, so let's bring it all together. What are the key takeaways from this deep dive into the Battle of the Cedars?
Well, I think, what we've seen here is a series of relatively small military engagements.
Yeah.
But they nonetheless resulted in a clear victory for the Anglo-Iroquois forces.
Right.
And capture of a significant number of American troops.
Yeah. And I think even more importantly, we've really gotten a glimpse into the decision by the Continental Congress to reject this prisoner exchange.
Right.
And that decision was based on these possibly exaggerated reports of enemy atrocities.
Right.
So, it's a really interesting case study.
Yeah, it is.
In how, wartime propaganda and public sentiment can really influence political decisions.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And the other thing I think is that the Battle of the Cedars, even though it wasn't, a major decisive battle, I think it really just highlights the complexity of the Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
You had British regulars, Canadian militia, Iroquois warriors on one side, and then you had American Continentals and some Canadian sympathizers on the other side.
Right. It's not just a simple...
It was not a simple two-sided war.
Two-sided, good versus evil kind of narrative.
Yeah. So what can our listener take away from all of this?
Well, I think, the Battle of the Cedars, while perhaps not a household name, I think it offers a really valuable lens through which to understand, the multifaceted nature of the American Revolution.
Yeah.
This wasn't just about, the 13 colonies versus Great Britain.
Right.
This involved numerous other actors with their own, distinct interests and agendas.
Yeah. And I think, it also raises this important question for us to all consider, how do these exaggerated accounts and politically motivated decisions that are made in the heat of conflict, how do those affect diplomacy, the treatment of prisoners, and even the way that we understand history itself?
Yeah.
I think this seemingly minor series of skirmishes, really just speaks to those enduring difficulties of establishing truth and fostering reconciliation during and after a war.
Absolutely. And I think for me, the big takeaway is that it's so important to look beyond the headlines, to look beyond the simple narratives.
Right.
And to really try to understand, the deeper and often much more complex realities of historical events.
Well said. Well, this has been another fascinating deep dive.
Yeah.
Hope you all enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.